Hello and welcome to Accent. Well, Accent is 5 years old, and I'd like to thank all of you for being a loyal audience by watching, expressing your opinions, and encouraging me to continue. Since the unfortunate events of September 11th, Accent has provided a forum for cultural exchange, understanding, and respect among diverse cultures by hosting prominent and knowledgeable guests discussing the current political and cultural issues. We have made the effort to produce an informative program for our audience and hope we can continue on this path with your support. In the past few years, Iran has been the focus of international debate while an enigma to the American foreign policy. The Middle East and what is happening in the region remains a highly sensitive foreign policy issue to the United States, as well as affecting the world's politics. It seems as the United States and Iran are at the gambling table. Is Iran holding a strong hand or keeping a poker face? Is Iran, as Barbara Slavin puts it, a better friend or a bosom enemy, or both? Well, Barbara is here today, gracing this stage to discuss her timely and interesting book and delving into the fascinating interplay between the United States and Iran. Barbara Slavin has been senior diplomatic reporter for the USA Today for the past 11 years. And in that capacity, she has traveled to Iran 6 times. She is currently a fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C., working on a project about Iran's rising influence in the Middle East. And now here is Barbara.
Hello.
Very welcome.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here again.
And it's a real pleasure to have you again. I remember that I had you here probably about 7-8 years ago.
Yeah, I think my hair was all dark, so it must have been a long time ago.
Probably mine too, except I have color on it.
Anyway, it's good to be back.
It's good to have you, and congratulations on your book.
Thank you very much.
I'm really, I feel as like I've done something myself. It's a good feeling, I bet. So I know that you have been very involved with the Iran issue. You have traveled, as we say, at least 6 times. And let me ask you, when was the first and when was the last that you went to Iran?
First time I went was in 1996. It was just after I got the job at USA Today. And I had always wanted to go to Iran, but somehow didn't get there. I'd lived in Cairo in the 1980s, and I almost went in 1989 when Khomeini died. Mm-hmm. But I was pregnant at the time, and I thought it's not a good idea.
Not at all.
So I didn't get to go. And then when I joined USA Today, I had an editor, very nice editor, who was very interested in the circumstances of women in the Muslim world. And the Taliban had just consolidated power in Afghanistan. So she said, why don't you go and do a story about the status of women? And I thought, well, I'll go back to Cairo because I lived there for 4 years and I know it well. And I said, why don't I go to Iran?
What a nice idea.
She said, sure, why not? And I was quite frightened, actually, the first time I went because, I'd heard a lot of scary stories, but I'd also heard from other journalists that it was a fascinating country. So I went in November of 1996, and I got hooked.
So that was the first time?
It was the first time. And, I had a great trip, fascinating trip. And then I kept going back. Sometimes the intervals were rather long. There was a period when they wouldn't give me a visa for 3 or 4 years. They were angry at some story I'd written. But the last trip was in February of 2006.
So I gather that this book is the product of years of going back and forth to Iran.
It is. It is.
Accumulating all your experiences and observations.
It tries to do a lot of things. It has some personal experiences in it, which
is good.
To leaven it, so it's not just dull
Wonderful.
analysis.
So we have a lot to talk about.
There's some personal experiences, but there's also a lot of history and political analysis, and there's a lot about U.S. policy because, I was very fortunate. Most newspapers don't have permanent correspondents in Iran, and so USA Today would let me go back from time to time. But I was also covering Madeleine Albright and Colin Powell and Condi Rice and the administration attitude toward Iran and watching the policy form or not be formed and change.
Actually, you have gone through 2 administrations that have been highly involved with Iran, Clinton administration and Bush, and we're going to talk about that in great deal later on.
Right.
Okay, the title is fascinating, and it's, I think, appropriate, but I'd like to hear it from you, that why you put that title on it.
Well, this title came from my husband, Michael Ross, who was a journalist for many years. And when we were in Cairo, someone said it to him at a cocktail party, and they meant it the other way around. They meant bosom friends, bitter enemies, but screwed it up somehow. And he kind of filed it away in the back of his head. He thought he might write a book at some point about the U.S. and the Arab world. But he didn't. He changed careers, as it turned out. And when I was thinking of titles, what would I call it? What would I call it? He suggested it, and it just
Do you know
clicked.
why he suggested that? That this enemy and friend thing, isn't that the core of what's the trouble between Iran and the United States?
Absolutely.
Do you
Well,
like to elaborate on that?
He had read the first chapter, and so I think he thought it really worked perfectly. I mean, when you look at our history, we were close allies for many years.
I'd like you give a little bit of that history for the audience.
Sure,
Some
for those
that they
who
are not probably that familiar with the background of U.S.-Iran foreign policy.
Well, for those who don't know, the United States was considered a very positive influence on Iran going back to the early part of the last century. There was even an American who died during the constitutional revolution. I think his name was Baskerville.
I've read about that.
Yeah,
Yes.
died in Tabriz
Yes.
during the, the...
That's fascinating.
Quite fascinating.
How Americans have been involved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there were various Americans who came. They were economic advisors to different governments. They tried to help teach Iranians how to do a proper government budget. And they were always considered somehow a benign influence compared to the British, who were hated and despised because they controlled the oil. And the Americans were thought to be there really just to help the Iranian people. And
Iranians always considered Americans friends. It was
Yeah.
not only political allies, just people to people. There was always this affection.
I think so. I think so. And Americans felt the same way toward Iran. And this continued really up until 1953, when there was a prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who nationalized the oil industry in Iran. And the British were very angry, but they didn't have the power then, so they asked Eisenhower administration and the CIA to get rid of this Mossadegh and to organize a coup.
Was at the time prime minister.
He was
very
the prime
powerful.
minister, and very popular.
Very powerful
very,
and
very
popular. Yes.
So the CIA organized a coup and got rid of Mossadegh and brought back the Shah of Iran, who had fled to Rome with his wife and probably thought he was never coming back. But the CIA got rid of Mossadegh, so he came back and was reinstalled. And he stayed in power until 1979, when there was a popular revolution against him. He was overthrown by people who thought, who blamed the United States for bringing him back.
Absolutely. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to reiterate what you just said. That don't you think that was a turning point, that sort of Iranians become cynical and pessimistic about the United States and its intentions?
I think so.
To elaborate?
I think 1953 was certainly a turning point, and of course 1979 was an enormous turning point. But at the same time, you still had Iranians coming to this country for education. You had tens of thousands who studied in the 1970s. The Shah, for all his faults, often paid tuition for young Iranians to come to the West, particularly to the United States. And I've met so many Iranians who studied here.
Our Air Force. Everyone in Air Force has been trained here.
Yeah, and even one, I remember a friend who's now a professor at University of Tehran, who became an Islamic fundamentalist in Pasadena, Texas. He was studying at some small college there and got very involved in the anti-Shah movement, got very religious, and where? In the heart of the Christian fundamentalist belt of the United States, in
it's
Texas.
such an irony that in order to be opposition to Shah, you have to be Islamist.
Yeah.
Although
Islam not everyone was.
Well, although Islam is the official religion of Iran, but I don't think that means necessarily you should, go that extreme of, way in order to oppose Shah's government.
Right.
But,
and not everyone did.
Not everyone did, but it turned out to be that
No,
way in a major way.
It did. I mean, Khomeini came in and he